The door of the store opened with the melodious tinkle of a bell, but no one even looked up as James stepped inside. His cane clattered softly against the tile floor as he slowly made his way forward. The man's face expressed fatigue, but his gaze remained focused. He didn't need much, a bag of groceries and some milk to get him through the rest of the day. But as soon as he looked up and noticed the manager's gaze, his heart clenched. At first glance, it was just another glance of a person scanning visitors. But this time it was filled with a cold contempt that could not be confused with indifference. It was the same look James knew all too well, the look that made him feel like a stranger in his own country. The manager, a tall man in an immaculately pressed shirt, stood behind the counter with his arms crossed over his chest. His lips were pressed into a thin line and his eyes seemed to burn through James. The feeling that he was literally sizing him up from head to toe left a sickening sensation. "Hey, you, what do you want here?" The manager threw loudly, not even trying to hide his irritation. There was more than the usual tiredness or discontent in his voice. It was a mixture of arrogance and something else, something dark and deep-rooted. James stopped. The silence that followed the manager's words seemed to fall on the entire store. Several customers, who were poring over the merchandise on the shelves, turned around abruptly. Their gazes pierced the air, but no one said a word. "I just came to get groceries," James answered slowly, his voice sounding calm, but there was tension in it. He knew that situations like this could get out of hand at any second. "We don't have what you need," the manager interrupted sharply. "You must be lost. This is not a charity shop." The words cut through the air like a knife. James stood still, but he was seething inside. His fingers gripped the handle of his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, trying to keep himself from flaring up in anger. "I just want to buy milk and bread," he repeated calmly, not moving from his seat. "I said you don't get service here." The manager's voice got louder, and now he was speaking so that everyone around him could hear. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. So leave before I call the police." This time, the silence was even more oppressive. The air in the room seemed to thicken to the point where it was hard to breathe. James looked around. The other shoppers' eyes were full of sympathy, but no one made a move to protect him. Everyone was hiding behind the safe barrier of inaction. The manager continued to stare at him, as if expecting James to comply, lower his head, and walk out. But instead, James straightened up, despite the pain that constantly reminded him of himself, and slowly pulled his phone out of his pocket. "Go away," I said, the manager shouted sharply, stepping forward. His face was twisted with anger, but now there was something else in his eyes, a slight shadow of anxiety. James didn't answer. His fingers dialed the number confidently, and the voice on the phone was calm and determined. This time, the silence of the crowd took on a different hue anticipation. Something had changed. Something important was just beginning. The phone in James's hands trembled, but he kept his gaze fixed on the manager. The excited buzz of voices among the shoppers enlivened the room for a moment, but quickly subsided. All eyes were on the man with the cane, who, despite his obvious humiliation, stood with dignity, like a stone statue in the midst of the ruins. "Don't you get it?" The manager hummed loudly, throwing his hand toward the door. "I'm not going to cater to people like you. You're only wasting our time. The people in line want to shop, not listen to your pathetic attempts to assert their rights." James felt a familiar wave of anger rising in his chest, but instead of letting it go, he took another deep breath. He knew that if he answered too harshly, It would only make things worse. "You're refusing me for no reason," he said calmly, though his voice sounded strained. "It's against the law." "The law?" The manager snorted, glancing at the customers as if looking for support. "This guy is talking about the law. Look at him, a handicapped person with a cell phone. You think your complaints mean anything? Do you have any idea where you are? Get out before I do something you'll regret." The hall froze. The air seemed to vibrate with tension. Some of the customers looked away, pretending to look at the price tags or searching the shelves. But deep down, they all knew this was the moment to intervene. And no one did. "Not only are you wasting my time, but you're ruining the atmosphere here," the manager continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "People came to shop, and you brought your problems here. You're not welcome here, okay?" James was still holding the phone to his ear, his face unruffled. But each offensive comment penetrated to the very depths of his soul. He could feel the words burning him, a heavy weight weighing on his shoulders. "Look at him." The manager turned to the crowd as if playing a play. "He's going to come in here, pathetic, worthless, and demand respect. First, learn to be a human being, then come to my store." These words seemed to echo around the room, hitting everyone in the very center. The woman at the bread rack froze, her eyes full of fear and pity. The man at the cash register shifted in his seat, but never said a word. "You can't even stand on your own 2 feet, and you're still at it," the manager finished, taking a step closer to James, his tone threatening. "So get out." Now, James slowly lowered the phone. His gaze became hard, piercing. But before he could say anything, one of the customers, a young hooded guy, couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, would you stop it?" he muttered, but his voice was drowned out by the tension. "Does that concern you?" the manager shouted, turning to the boy. "If you want, you can leave with him. It's simple here. I decide who gets served and who doesn't." The boy, embarrassed, looked away. James was left alone with the cold face of hatred. But before the manager could say anything else, James spoke. His voice was low but firm, like the thunder of a storm. "You've made a mistake. You think you can say and do whatever you want just because you have power here, but you have no idea what the people you're humiliating are capable of." James's words seemed to pierce the space, making even the manager freeze for a second. But then he grinned again. "Oh, go ahead. Call your friends or activists or whoever. Nothing's gonna change. You're still gonna walk out of here with nothing." James picked up the phone and dialed again. His voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. "This is just the beginning," he said before saying something briefly into the phone. All the store's attention was on him. Even the manager was silent for a moment. Something in the expression on James's face made him uneasy. But anxiety had not yet completely overtaken the manager. He felt like he was in control, a mistake that would soon change everything. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you hear our stories from. Perhaps you or someone you know had a similar case in life. Share your thoughts and impressions. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. The silence in the store was oppressive. Even the sounds of the refrigerators and air conditioners seemed to have died down, giving way to the tension that hung in the air. James stood still, as if chained to the floor. His cane, which had served as his support, now seemed to symbolize his struggle. But no one moved to support him. The customers carefully turned away, pretending not to be concerned. A young woman with a baby in a stroller quickly selected a carton of milk and headed for the exit, as if trying to escape from the scene. A man in a suit adjusted his tie and pretended to scrutinize something on a rack of cookies. No one made eye contact with James. The crowd began to thin. Some who couldn't stand the tension hurriedly left the store with their heads down as if no one could see them. They didn't want to be part of what was happening. Their silence was louder than any words. "Look at them," the manager suddenly spoke, putting his arm around the others. "No one cares about your claims. You think anyone here is going to defend you? Everyone just wants to make their purchases and leave." These words seemed to stir up even more fear in people. The woman with the grocery basket quickly retreated to the back of the store, trying to stay out of the conflict zone. Someone threw a brief look of pity in James's direction, but turned away. "They're looking at you," the manager continued, his voice louder than it needed to be, "and they're all thinking the same thing. Why doesn't he just leave? You're only causing irritation. No one will interfere." The words sounded like a cold sentence. James looked around the store. People were hiding their faces, avoiding his gaze, as if they were afraid that looking at him would automatically bring them into the conflict. But he saw their fear and understood its nature. It wasn't him they were afraid of. They were afraid of being a target. In the far corner of the store stood a teenager with a cell phone, filming what was happening. He wasn't trying to help, but his camera was catching every moment. James felt a stab of pain. Even the one who could have raised his voice preferred to remain a bystander. "Go away, please," the girl at the register said shyly, her voice barely cutting through the silence. She avoided looking at James, looking somewhere to the side. "You're only making this more difficult." "Complicating things?" James turned in her direction, his voice as hard as steel. "Or am I showing that there's something wrong with this situation? What do you think I should do? Just walk away, giving this man the right to humiliate me?" The girl answered nothing. Her face turned pale and she lowered her gaze. The manager smirked, sensing his victory. "Did you hear what the girl said?" His voice was full of contempt. "Nobody wants you here. You're making this harder on yourself." The crowd remained silent. There was everything in that silence: fear, indifference, and, for some, a hidden sense of guilt. No one wanted to admit that they were now part of the problem. Everyone thought it was better to just stay out of it. But James saw them, and that silence screamed louder than any words could. "Do you think your silence makes you innocent?" he asked suddenly, turning to the crowd. His voice was firm, but there was pain and frustration in it. "What if you don't say anything? It won't be your problem. But you choose sides too. Your inaction makes you just as guilty as him." James's words seemed to prick people's consciences. Some flinched slightly, some turned further away. But no one uttered a word. They remained in their seats, like spectators watching a tragedy they wanted no part of. But James knew this was not the end. The oppressive silence that surrounded him was only the silence before the storm, and the storm, he could feel it, was on its way. "People like me?" James repeated the manager's words, and this time he sounded threatening. His gaze became as sharp as a knife. "Say it again. Let everyone here hear what you mean." The manager froze for a moment. James's tone caught him off guard, but he quickly regained his confidence. The audience was still silent, which meant he had support, albeit in the form of indifference. "You know what I mean," he said, squinting his eyes at me. "You don't belong in this store. I decide who's a customer and who isn't. You don't even realize how much I've already done to be polite. But I guess you need to get it straight. Go away." The words echoed through the room, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness and coldness. James took a step forward, his cane clattering heavily to the floor. He had to restrain himself from letting the anger that was boiling up inside of him get to him. "You say this in the presence of witnesses." He looked around slowly. "And you're not even afraid of the consequences? Do you think it will go unpunished?" "Witnesses?" The manager laughed, but there was irritation in his voice now. "No one here has seen anything." "Really?" He looked around the crowd. "Everyone just wants to do their shopping, and nobody's going to interfere with anything that doesn't concern them." The crowd froze again, as if his words were a spell that made everyone freeze in place. No one said a word. Some averted their eyes, some took a step back, trying not to be drawn in. But James didn't give up. "You can humiliate me with words, but I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "I've done nothing to deserve this treatment. I have the same rights as any other customer in this store, and I will stand here until you fulfill your duties." For a moment, the room was again filled with a heavy silence. The manager shook his head, his face contorted with anger. "Do you think your rights mean anything here?" He stepped closer, his voice low but threatening. "You don't even know who you're talking to. I'm not going to serve you, and no one's going to make me do it." James picked up his cane and leaned on it, straightening his back. His face stiffened, but his eyes remained calm. "Then you'll have to explain that to the court," he said, pulling out his phone and taking a few pictures of the manager's face and the surroundings. "And anyone else who sees this video, I've already called. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." The manager tensed. His smug smile trembled slightly, but he didn't show it. "You can call whoever you want," he said, but there was a noticeable strain in his voice. "No one's coming here for someone like you." Those words were the last straw. They came louder than anything else, like a clap of thunder. The crowd stirred slightly, as if the words had shaken even those who were trying to stay away. "Like me?" James leaned forward, his voice quieter but firmer. "Do you mean disabled, or are you talking about my skin color?" The manager said nothing. His face remained cold, but now there was a faint shadow of fear in his eyes. "You don't understand anything," James continued, taking another step forward. "Every time you humiliate someone, you only make us stronger. People don't forget, and I'm not leaving here until you answer for your words." The crowd began to shift. Some moved a little closer. Others had already taken out their phones to record what was happening. In this silence, full of tension, it was clear. Something was changing, but the real denouement was still a long way off. James knew he was on the cusp of something bigger, and he wasn't about to back down. James took a deep breath, trying to curb the trembling in his hands. His cane wobbled slightly as he pulled the phone out of his pocket with one hand. There was still an oppressive silence all around. The crowd held its breath, and the manager looked at him with a wry grin. "What are you going to do?" threw the manager. "Call Mommy or your activists? No one's coming here to get you." James didn't say anything. His fingers steadily pressed the screen, dialing the number. There was a hardness in his eyes that kept the manager from relaxing completely. When the dial tone came over the speaker, the air in the store became almost tangible. The crowd began to move closer, people slowly taking out their phones, preparing to take pictures. "Hi, it's James." His voice was low but trembling with emotion. "I need your help. It's an emergency." There was a sharp reply from the other side of the phone. indistinguishable to the others, but James nodded slightly. He continued speaking, ignoring the whispers among the crowd. "I'm in a store on King Street. The manager refuses to serve me. He's openly humiliating me because of my condition and skin color. I need you to get here. Yes, as soon as possible. This cannot go unpunished." The manager hummed, though there was a flicker of concern in his gaze. "You think someone's going to save you?" He stepped closer, his voice louder to overlap James's words. "You put yourself in this position. Do you even realize how ridiculous this looks? Who's coming here? The police? They'll be on my side." James put the phone down but didn't turn off the connection. His caller was still on the line, and he knew that every word the manager said was now audible. "I've already made sure this situation doesn't go unnoticed," he said calmly, his voice no longer trembling. "And you will be held accountable for your actions." The crowd froze again. Now the tension was felt by everyone. Some tried to leave so as not to be involved, but most stayed, their phones pointed at the manager. "Are you threatening me?" The manager stepped forward, his face pale, but he tried to remain confident. "You think I'm afraid? This is my store. I make the rules here." But there was uncertainty in his voice. One of the employees approached him, whispering something like, "Why don't we just serve him?" The manager brushed it off, but his gaze became less hard. "You're wrong," James replied, picking up the phone and putting it on speaker. "You don't make the rules here. The rules already exist, and they protect people like me." A voice came from the phone, deep and confident. "This is James's lawyer," said the interlocutor. "I have already contacted the local authorities and am preparing a formal complaint. All your actions are now being recorded. Do you want to continue humiliating my client, or are we going to settle this in court?" These words sounded like a hammer blow. The crowd tensed. People whispered louder and louder. A smile appeared on the faces of some customers, while others looked at the manager with undisguised condemnation. The manager turned pale, his smugness evaporating. He opened his mouth to say something, but instead turned quickly to his staff. "Call the owner." He threw it sharply, but his voice no longer sounded confident. He realized the situation was out of control. "Time's up," James said firmly, looking straight into the manager's eyes. "You wanted to humiliate me? Now the whole town will see your actions." James's words sounded louder than the lawyer's voice. The crowd, sensing that the situation was changing, began to move closer. Someone said loudly, "This is too much," and others nodded. James realized this conversation was really going to change everything. "Is that a lawyer?" The manager's voice, which had recently sounded confident, now trembled. He tried to maintain a semblance of control, but his face gave everything away. His smile was gone, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for a way out. The phone in James's hand was still on speakerphone, and the lawyer on the other end of the line continued to speak clearly and without emotion. "Mr. Manager, I would advise you to reconsider your behavior. This place is under video surveillance, and recordings of your remarks can be used in court. In addition, you are now obstructing service to a customer on the grounds of discrimination, which is against the law. I advise you to stop immediately." These words seemed to strike the manager in the heart. His hands trembled and he adjusted his tie, which had suddenly become too tight. He looked around. The crowd no longer looked indifferent. Shoppers stood closer, phones in hand, filming every second. Listen," he began, trying to get his tone back, but his voice sounded strained. "This whole thing, this is some kind of misunderstanding. We'll serve you, of course. It's just that we didn't mean to." "You didn't want to?" James interrupted sharply, his voice firmer than before. "Didn't mean to what? Humiliate me in public? Make a scene where you felt above the law? Or didn't want people to know who you really were?" The manager took a step back, his face beginning to be covered in sweat. No, you don't understand. It's all because of... He stammered, realizing that any excuses would only make things worse. "We understand enough." The lawyer's voice came again from the phone. "The press and the local police are on their way to the store right now. You'd better start behaving in a way that at least partially preserves your reputation." "The press?" the manager asked in a whisper, his face contorted with fear. He turned to his staff, but they were looking at him as dumbfounded as everyone else. "No, this can't be." He grabbed the phone off the table and quickly started dialing, covering the receiver with his hand. His voice was muffled, but the words were audible. "Listen, we have a problem. There's a client here. No, he's already called his lawyer. Come right away." When he hung up, his gaze met James's eyes. It was all there: fear, confusion, and despair. "Look, He took a step forward, his tone almost pleading. "We can work this out. It's just a misunderstanding, really. I'll personally bring you everything you wanted to buy, free of charge, as a sign of goodwill." "Goodwill?" James couldn't hold back a bitter chuckle. "After everything you said? After you humiliated me in front of everyone? Do you think that's enough?" The manager panicked even more. The crowd began to whisper quietly, and the voices grew louder and louder. "He was scared," someone said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Now he's trying to get out of it." These words hit the manager harder than any legal argument. He turned around to find support among his employees or customers, but only met with condemning glances. The crowd was no longer silent, and although many were still hesitant to intervene directly, their presence was a formidable reminder. He was not in his fortress. "Please," he began, trying to drown out the noise, "let's not make a big deal out of this. It was a misunderstanding. I was just wrong." James raised his hand, silencing the manager. His calmness, which contrasted with the manager's nervous demeanor, caused everyone in the store to freeze. "Misunderstanding," James said quietly but firmly. "A misunderstanding is an accidental mistake, an unintentional act. What you did was a deliberate choice. You thought I would go quietly. You thought you could humiliate me and not be held responsible." The crowd murmured approvingly. Someone clapped their hands. The manager stepped back, his face pale. Now he realized that the situation was out of his control. "I have nothing more to say to you," James continued, addressing not only the manager but the crowd as well. "Words are only part of the problem. Let the actions speak for themselves." A siren wailed in the distance. The police were closing in. Someone in the crowd started filming even more intensely, anticipating that the story would go viral. The manager tried again to say something, but his voice was drowned in the noise. He realized that anything he said now would only make his situation worse, and James stood still, waiting for justice, and he knew that this moment would change not only his day, but perhaps the whole system that allowed people like this manager to feel unpunished. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you hear our stories from. Have similar situations happen in your life or the lives of people you know? Share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. The first sounds of the sirens, quiet and distant, echoed through the manager's mind, shattering his confidence. His face, which had recently expressed contemptuous smugness, was now twisted with alarm. He cast a quick glance at the doors, then at the employees behind the cash registers, who, like the customers, made no secret of their tension. The crowd was no longer silent. The whispering, like the rumbling of a distant sea, was growing stronger by the second. "I'll be right back," the manager mumbled, but his voice was so weak that even the closest employees could hardly hear him. His footsteps, quick and uneven, took him behind the counter and farther into the back of the store, toward the service area. The shoppers, previously almost paralyzed by the situation, began to move. Some of them were whispering about what was going on, glancing at James, who stood like a rock. His face was calm, but there was determination in his eyes, as if he had already won the fight. But inside he still felt the tension. He knew he hadn't won yet. "Did you see how pale he looked?" someone in the crowd said, trying to be quiet enough not to be overheard. "I think he realized he'd gone too far." "Do you think it will go to court?" another voice whispered back. He'd obviously done something serious if they'd called a lawyer. Meanwhile, one of the employees, a young man in his 20s, hesitantly looked out from behind the counter where he had been hiding during the conflict. His hands were shaking as he tried to continue scanning the merchandise for the customer, but he couldn't focus. He quickly glanced toward the door where the manager had gone and said quietly to his co-worker, "We have to do something. This is out of control. It's his own fault, but now it's on us." My colleague, an older woman, only shook her head. Her face was a mixture of fatigue and fear. "Don't do anything," she replied quietly. "Just wait. It'll work itself out. You didn't see what happened, okay?" But their whispers did not calm the situation. The whole atmosphere in the store seemed to be heated to the max. The people in the crowd began to talk louder and louder. Some of them were indignant, others pitying James, but most of them remained wary, as if they were afraid that any wrong move would drag them into this confrontation. James stood still, but watched carefully. He noticed how several customers with cameras were now pointing their lenses not only at him, but also at the doorway where the manager had disappeared. Some of the employees began to talk fidgetily, their movements becoming quick and nervous. They clearly didn't know what to do, but their fear was evident on their faces. "Is he summoning someone?" someone in the crowd asked, nodding toward the service area. "Maybe the police? Or maybe he's trying to make a deal to keep this quiet." "Do you think he can get away with it?" came another voice. "After everything we've seen?" "I doubt it." The crowd was not unanimous. Some hoped for justice, others thought the whole situation was over-dramatized. But everyone realized that something important was going to happen in the next few minutes. The whispering grew louder as footsteps approached from the back of the store. The manager had returned, but his gait was no longer confident. He moved slowly, as if trying to remain inconspicuous. In his hands was a cell phone, which he clutched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His gaze darted between the crowd and James, as if he were looking for someone to take his side. "Look," he began, trying to make his voice firm, but the words sounded unconvincing. We're going to sort this out. This is a misunderstanding." James didn't answer. His silence was stronger than any words. The manager noticed it and swallowed nervously. Then he turned to his staff, whispered something to one of them, and with a nod he hurried toward the warehouse. "He's afraid," one of the shoppers said loudly, his voice echoing through the store. "Look at him. He can't get away." The manager tried to say something, but was interrupted by the loud sound of the door opening. A uniformed man entered the store, a security guard, or perhaps the police. His gaze quickly assessed the situation, then settled on James. Everyone froze. The tension had reached its peak. People were waiting for the outcome, and James, without taking his eyes off the manager, was preparing himself for what was about to happen. He knew that the fear that gripped the manager was only the beginning. Real justice was on its way. The doors of the store opened again, and the sound of their mechanical click sounded like a gunshot in the lingering silence. Several men in strict suits appeared on the threshold, their steps confident and their faces impenetrable. Behind them came two more uniformed men, their serious look leaving no doubt. They were representatives of the authorities. Their appearance was as sudden as a thunderous storm, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The crowd, which had been murmuring and watching from the sidelines, now began to slowly part, allowing the newcomers to pass. The manager, who a moment ago had been trying to look like a master of the situation, froze as if he had been nailed to the floor. His eyes rounded and his face turned gray as ash. He clutched the phone in his hand so hard it looked like he was about to break it. The deep breath he took didn't help calm him down. He clearly knew who these people were and why they had come. His nervousness was contagious. The crowd, sensing it, froze in anticipation, as if it were all happening in slow motion. The man in the suit was the first to speak. His voice was calm, but there was a power in it that didn't require raised tones to make people obey. He looked at the manager without blinking and said, "We received a call about a serious incident in this store. I assume you're in charge here?" The manager opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. He only nodded, and it was like an admission of guilt. His gaze flicked to the crowd, as if he were looking for support, but he met only cold, judgmental eyes. No one looked away anymore. Now everyone wanted to see how this would end. The man in the suit stepped forward, pacing slightly, like a predator intent on finding out every detail before delivering the final blow. "I need your explanation," he said, looking coldly at the manager. "There has been discrimination here, videotaped and confirmed by witnesses. We're here to investigate, but I warn you that trying to cover anything up will only make things worse for you." The manager began to speak, his voice trembling as his whole body did. It's a misunderstanding," he mumbled. This customer, he was acting aggressively, and I was trying to protect the staff, that's all." James, who had been watching silently all this time, stepped forward. His cane clattered to the floor, and the sound, like the beat of justice, silenced everyone. "Aggressive?" His voice was quiet, but every syllable was imbued with righteous anger. "Did you call it aggressive when you asked me to buy groceries? Did you call it defense when you humiliated me in front of everyone by calling me like me? Or are you referring to your insults against me because of my disability and skin color? Is all of that what you call defense?" The crowd murmured approvingly, and some began to whisper louder. One of the visitors even shouted, "We saw the whole thing. He's telling the truth." The uniformed man, standing next to the man in the suit, took a step forward, interrupting the noise. "We have witness statements and video," he said, addressing the manager. "Your actions and words violate several laws, including racial discrimination and denial of service for reasons that are unacceptable. This is a serious charge." The manager's face twisted. His eyes darted from the employees to the customers, then to the uniformed men. He suddenly realized that his usual excuses were no longer working. No one was going to cover his mistakes anymore. Not so long ago he had felt invulnerable, but now all his power was crumbling like a house of cards. I didn't mean to," he almost shouted. "This was all a misunderstanding. I just—" "That's enough," the man in the suit interrupted him coldly. "We've heard enough." At that moment, the door opened again, and another man stepped inside. It was a member of the local press with a camera and microphone. He stopped at the entrance, looking around, then pointed the camera at James and the group of officials. "Sorry for the intrusion," he said, but his voice was not apologetic. "We received a report of an incident here and would like to ask a few questions." This moment was the culmination of everything that was going on. The manager looked as if his legs were about to fail. He glanced at the man in the suit, hoping for some kind of protection, but found only cold indifference. "You will ask questions later," the uniformed man said, addressing the reporter. "Now we have to finalize the protocol." Meanwhile, the camera was pointed at James. He didn't need to say anything. His look of dignity and firmness spoke for itself. He knew the truth was on his side, and now everyone would see it. The door of the store opened again, and this time another man, a representative of the local prosecutor's office, entered the room. His stern appearance, professional restraint, and the folder of documents in his hands reinforced the feeling that something big was about to happen. His steps were confident, like a man who knew he had indisputable evidence. He walked up to the group of officials, briefly introduced himself, and, glancing at the manager, said, "We have received information that requires urgent attention. This applies not only to today's incident, but also to a number of past incidents involving this store and you personally." These words fell into the hall like a clap of thunder. The crowd, ready to see the denouement, froze in tense anticipation. The reporter standing at the door raised his camera a little higher to capture every detail. The manager, who had barely been on his feet before, now looked as if the world beneath him had begun to crumble. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about." His voice shook, and his gaze darted around the room for support. No one made a move toward him. The representative of the prosecutor's office opened the folder, took out several sheets, and spread them out on the nearest counter. He took his time, making the manager and everyone present feel every hammer blow that came down on him. "There have been several complaints of discrimination in this store over the past year," he began, looking directly at the manager. "Your practice of denying service to certain groups of people has been investigated many times. But, in the past, there was not enough evidence or witnesses to bring the case to court. Today, the situation has changed." The crowd gasped. Every whisper was now heard, as if amplified by an echo. People who had been holding back a short time ago began to whisper, a mixture of shock and indignation in their voices. The reporter stepped forward, pointing the microphone at the prosecutor, trying to catch every word. It's not true," the manager almost shouted, his voice breaking into a croak. "It's just mistakes. I've never done anything like that." But the prosecutor, disregarding his protests, continued. "Several witnesses indicated that you regularly use derogatory language towards customers of a certain race. Moreover, we have evidence that you deliberately overcharged certain groups of customers, creating additional barriers for them." These words caused a new wave of shock among the crowd. People began to speak louder, openly discussing what they had heard. Some of the shoppers, standing closer to the prosecutor, began to shout their accusations. "It's true. I've seen him talk to people like that myself. He yelled at me when I tried to find out something. I can see why I've always felt like a stranger here." The manager tried to shout over the crowd, his face now flushed red, and he looked like he was ready to burst with anger and fear at the same time. "It's all lies," he shouted, his voice full of despair. "These people just want to turn you against me. It's a conspiracy." But the prosecutor wouldn't let him be distracted. "In addition," he continued, pulling another document from the folder, "we have complaints from employees. Several of them claim that you threatened them with dismissal for trying to object or protect customers from unfair treatment. Your management practices were not only discriminatory, but intimidating. This is no longer just breaking the law, it is a systematic abuse of power." The manager swayed as if those words had physically hit him. He grabbed the counter to keep from falling, but his eyes were now filled with terror. The reporter, sensing the sensation, pointed the camera directly at his face, capturing every detail of his fall from the confident owner to the confused and exposed deceiver. I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, but he couldn't even believe his own words. Meanwhile, the prosecutor turned to James, his voice softer but still official. "Mr. James, your complaint was crucial to this case. You not only drew attention to a serious incident, but also helped uncover a systematic injustice. Your patience and courage allowed us to take this to its logical conclusion." James said nothing, but his look of dignity spoke for itself. He realized that the truth was now out in the open, and no manager's excuses could hide it. Meanwhile, people in the crowd began to applaud. It was not just an applause of support, but an expression of collective relief and justice. The manager slowly settled into the nearest chair, his hands shaking and his eyes staring into the void. He knew it was over. There was tension in the air, so thick that you could feel it physically. The manager sat in a chair behind the counter, his hands shaking and his face dead pale. The crowd was silent, but every look directed at him was full of judgment. His world, built on illusions of power and impunity, seemed to be crumbling by the second. The representative of the prosecutor's office put the documents back in the folder and looked at the manager with a cold expression. His voice was calm but firm, like a hammer passing judgment. "You have the opportunity to plead guilty," he said. "That may be taken into account in the final judgment. But, as you realize, words are only the beginning. You will have to answer for everything you have done." The manager slowly raised his head, his eyes wandering through the crowd, looking for a bit of sympathy. But he met only cold stares and condemnation. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, gathering all the courage he had left, he wheezed, I apologize." These words, spoken in a trembling voice, were so quiet that they were barely audible. The crowd did not move. No one said a word in response. Time seemed to stand still, making the manager feel the weight of his actions. "Louder!" came a voice from the crowd, cold and hard. It was the young man who had been filming the whole time. "Let everyone hear you admit your guilt." The manager swallowed hard. His voice, a little louder but still shaky, repeated, "I apologize. For everything. I didn't mean for it to go this far." James, who had been standing as still as a stone statue all this time, finally stepped forward. His cane clattered to the floor again, and the sound caught everyone's attention. He looked straight into the manager's eyes, and there was no hatred in his gaze, only firmness and dignity. "Apologies are a start," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But they mean nothing if they are not followed by action. Today you face the consequences of your decisions, But not just you. Everyone who remained silent, everyone who looked away while the injustice was happening, should consider that this is their responsibility too. These words echoed through the hall like a clap of thunder. The crowd held its breath. Some people looked away, realizing that James was talking about them too. It was a moment not only of exposure, but of insight. While James was talking, 2 more people entered the store, representatives of the owner of the chain of stores. Their faces were serious, and they were holding documents that clearly did not bode well for the manager. One of them approached James, nodded briefly, and said, "We would like to apologize on behalf of the company. This person will no longer represent us." The words sounded official, but there was sincerity in them. Then the man turned to the manager and, without hiding his irritation, said, "You are fired as of this minute. We will launch an internal investigation and cooperate with the authorities to ensure that this does not happen again." The crowd murmured. Some began to applaud. The manager sat as if his world had finally collapsed. He didn't try to protest, knowing it was useless. The only thing he could do was sit back and watch his power dissolve into thin air. James finally allowed himself to exhale. He knew this was his victory, but it wasn't his alone. It was a step forward for anyone who had ever faced such injustice. He turned to the crowd, his gaze hard. "Today we proved that we cannot be silent," he said. "Each of us can be strong. Each of us deserves respect, and if we fight for that, we can change the world." The crowd erupted in applause. James looked once more at the manager, who now looked like a shadow of himself. It was a final reminder that abuse of power was never without consequences. As James left the store, he could feel himself being watched. But now it wasn't looks of pity or judgment. It was a look of recognition. He left, leaving behind a story that would forever change not only this store, but the people who witnessed it. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or someone you know ever experienced racism? It is very important for us to know your opinion, because each of your stories and words are invaluable to us. We sincerely appreciate each of you and thank you for your attention. Subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share this video with those who may care about it. We wish you a good day and justice in every moment of your life.